This week we're studying World War II through Chapter 26. So initially, there was some friction with Japan between the United States and Japan. In 1904 to 1905, the U.S. actually supported Japan against Russia, but Teddy Roosevelt, as president at that time, moderated a compromise to end the Russo-Japanese War. Japan felt like they were deprived, and so they kind of started not trusting the U.S. To make matters worse, in San Francisco, Japanese children were segregated in schools. So this made the relationship even worse. In 1915, the Japanese established a brutal occupation of China, while others were actually fighting World War I. So while they were distracted, Japan went into China and demanded 21 things. So there's a total list of these 21 things, obviously, but the biggies were that they required China to stop leasing territory to foreign powers and to give Japanese control over Manchuria and Shantung. So out of these 20 original demands, the last demand, the 21st, was sent later and it actually demanded that the agreement would be made by May 7th, 1915, or that they would be in war. China knew that they couldn't win a war with Japan, so they agreed. Oops, went too far. Let's go back there. Okay. So while Japan is taking over China, there's a rise of fascism in Europe. With Mussolini in Italy, he came to power in 1922 and had a totalitarian regime. Under Mussolini's leadership, Italy brutally attacked Ethiopia in 1935. This led to the League of Nations sanctions against Italy, which was weakly supported by the US and other nations, so it really had no big impact there. At the same time, the Nazi Party in Germany under Hitler is growing as a fanatical right-wing nationalist movement that wanted to restore German pride and might, and they saw that other cultures were degenerate. And so this slide is actually a clip or a snip from a graphic novel by Art Spiegelman called Maus, M-A-U-S. It tells the story of the Holocaust that had been passed down to him from his father, who had actually been a prisoner of war. It uses personified animals as the characters. The mice in Maus represent the Jews. In some real-life Nazi propaganda, Jews were presented as vermin, and so that's why Spiegelman chose to use the mouse to represent the Jewish people in his story. Of course, the natural enemy of the mouse is the cat, so in Spiegelman's graphic novel, cats represent Nazis. And you can see where we would normally see a swastika on the German arm patch, which is worn by the cat, we see a skull to represent death. Hitler wanted to unite all Germans under one big German nation. And not all Americans actually at this time saw fascism or Nazism as a threat. One was because it was so far away. You know, it's not very close to America. Some even thought it was the wave of the future because it was pulling together culture. And we've talked throughout the semester about that fine line between patriotism and nationalism. And nothing defines it better than Hitler's Nazi Germany, where he sought to unite all Germans under one big German nation because Germans were the best, according to Hitler. And when you have one nation that's the best, it makes all others inferior. So this superiority is very dangerous, obviously. So while most Americans feared Nazism and fascism, some really thought that it might catch on. During this conflict, Roosevelt felt like the U.S. should support world order. he adopted this good neighbor policy, FDR's idea that the neighbor who respects himself respects the rights of others as well. So, we wanted to be a good neighbor, we wanted to help out, and didn't really want to get into the war. But as things continue in Europe, with Hitler invading Poland and other European countries, the United States begins to see that this is becoming a world event. Roosevelt wins a third term to the office of president, and he beat the Republican Wilkie rather easily, pretty much because voters didn't want someone new in office when foreign policy was at such a critical time. One of the ways that the United States participated in the war without initially getting into the war was through the Lend-Lease Bill. Now, American neutrality has been something that, Americans have tried to maintain for a long time, but this Lend-Lease Bill starts to erode at that. It really ends the U.S. concept of neutrality. At this point, Britain needed more direct help in the war. So this Lend-Lease Bill allowed Roosevelt to lend war materials to those countries that were protecting American interest. It supplied food, oil, and other materials to Great Britain, France, China, the Soviets, and other allied nations. A total of $50.1 billion was shipped in aid to these countries. 31.4 billion of that was to the UK. Like I said, with that kind of lending, the U.S. concept of neutrality is gone. We are actually supporting people in the war. So to further erode neutrality, the U.S. increases aid to England. It also put Greenland under U.S. protection and put German and Italian ships in U.S. ports under federal control. But, Hitler wasn't too bothered by it at this point because his main concern was Russia. So the U.S. provided help to the Russians. The U.S. also miscalculated or underestimated the power of the Japanese at this point. Japan was committed to its own expansionist policies, and it would not back down. The U.S. had actually supplied steel and petroleum to Japan until the fall of France. So in September 1940, Japan joined Germany and Italy. The U.S. continued negotiations with Japan, but it broke the Purple Cipher Code. So after breaking this code, the U.S. learns that Japan is actually planning an attack in the Pacific. We're just not exactly sure where. On the morning of December 7th, General Marshall sent radiograms to military bases in San Francisco, the Canal Zone, Hawaii, and the Philippines to warn of some sort of pending attack. But there was radio interference that delayed the message to Hawaii, so it had to be sent by Western Union. And when the message finally reached Hawaii, the bombing had already started. At this point, the U.S. is pulled into the war. On the home front, we have the first time draftees being inducted into service. So they're called GIs because their equipment and uniform was government issued, so GI from that. The military training was hard, and when people training in the military would get to go home for a break, they often complained about how hard this military training was. The new vocabulary actually rose from military service. One of those that you still hear today is SNAFU, which was actually an acronym for Situation All Fouled Up. And I'll include a link in the notes page to some other vocabulary that arose from World War II military service. So yes, we have our draftees training for war. We also have something else happening here. Because the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans are suddenly feared, because whether these people were actually immigrants from Japan or whether they were born here, it didn't matter. If they appeared to have Japanese heritage, a lot of times these people were feared. And they were actually housed in detention centers in Utah, Arizona, and Arkansas. A lot of times families would try to sell off everything they could so that they wouldn't lose everything. But anyway, we do have these centers set up in Utah, Arizona, and Arkansas. And one of the assignments in this week's module is to listen to George Takai talk about his experience in the detention center in Arkansas. So as far as African Americans went, war brought both good and bad to the African Americans. The workforce demand opened jobs that had previously discriminated against them, and more African Americans were admitted to the Marines and Navy at higher ranks. However, they were still segregated. This also put pressure on women and families, with the men being away at war. Starting in 1943, even married men were drafted. Before that, it was just single men. So married men and then fathers eventually were also drafted. From 1940 to 1945, the number of married women serving as head of household went from 770,000 to approximately 3 million. So women are entering workforce, working in the war industry. Working moms meant less care or structure for the children, and so juvenile delinquency also rose. This is an image of an African American woman working in a wartime factory. There's a link at the bottom if you'd like to see more pictures. And another picture of women working in wartime industry during World War II. The good thing was that the wartime economy actually was a boost to the American economy and returned prosperity. The role on the home front was to supply soldiers. From 1940 to 1945, the United States produced 300,000 aircraft, 5,425 merchant ships, 72,000 Navy ships, 87,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, 372,000 artillery pieces, and 44 billion rounds of small ammo. And this is an artist invasion of, or an artist depiction of the Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944 for a war bond drive. The casualties are difficult to find because those things were typically omitted from wartime propaganda. So during wartime, our relationships with our other ally countries was good, but with Russia, they weren't the best. Stalin was suspicious that the US and the UK would actually like to see Germany and Russia destroy each other. So he demanded that the UK and the US set up a second front in Europe to offer some sort of relief to Russia and to show their commitment to Russia in order to show him that they were committed to helping Russia. The US and the UK, however, wanted better planning before doing so. They didn't just want to barge in and jump in to set up a second front and not prepared. So the defeat of Germany actually came in February 1943. We'll move forward to talk about that a little bit. So English-speaking allies recovered North Africa from the Germans and Italians in late 1942. In February 1943, the Russian troops captured thousands of Germans near Stalingrad and forced surrender. In August 1943, Russia stops a new German attack. Mussolini resigns and surrenders, and in 1944, Germany begins to crumble. On June 6th, Allied warships approached the French coast in Normandy. Germany holds them back for about 6 weeks, but then General George Patton's men break through and attack the Germans. So one of the interesting things, the differences in the soldiers, is that the soldiers from the democratic nations had hope of returning home to their happy personal lives. And because of that, this made them more cautious. They weren't exactly super ready to run out in the line of fire. They wanted to return home. But soldiers from dictatorships were more stoic and willing to accept death. They would die for their cause. Maybe they had less to look forward to when they went home. So they were less cautious, especially think about the kamikaze pilots that we'll talk about shortly, the Japanese pilots who were on suicide missions. So the Yalta Conference was held in 1945. It was a meeting of Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, so Russia, England, and the United States. They discussed what the post-war would look like, post-war world would look like. So they decided they would establish 4 occupational zones in the defeated nation, one for each of them, plus one for France. They determined that they would root out Nazi influence from Germany to restore peace there. And they also decided that provisional governments would have democratic elections. Poland would be pro-Soviet Union. They also had some secret clauses to this Yalta Conference. One was about the repatriation of Soviet and American prisoners. They also discussed the voting formula for the Big Four nations in the UN Security Council. And then they determined that Russia would declare war on Japan 2 or 3 months after Germany's surrender. For this, they would receive the Kuril Islands and the southern half of the Sakhalin Islands off the Siberian coast, and an occupation zone in the northern half of Korea. In the last day of the Pacific War, the first kamikaze attacks came from the Japanese on October 25th, 1944. So a kamikaze attack is basically the suicide mission of crashing bomb-carrying planes into American ships. In Iwo Jima, 4,500 Americans died, compared to 21,000 Japanese soldiers who died there. Japanese lost Okinawa in February 1945. When that happened, Okinawa became a big air base for the Allies. However, the Japanese were still ready, willing, and able to fight. This is a picture of the Big Three at their meeting at the Yalta Conference. We have, from left to right on the front, we have Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. And you can see that FDR is a little bit frail, and actually 2 months after this photo, he passed away. FDR died in April 1945 from a cerebral hemorrhage. His vice president, Truman, then became president. So it was Truman who was president during this first nuclear attack. The bomb was launched from the Enola Gay ship on August 6, 1945, over Hiroshima. 2 days later, Russians declared war on Japan and moved into Manchuria. On August 9th, another nuclear attack was posed at Nagasaki. The surrender followed on September 2nd, and Emperor Hirohito was allowed to stay in power. So that's how World War II finally came to an end. That wraps up this week's lecture notes, and they're also attached here as a document in case you'd like to go back to read them. And also, don't forget to check out some of that slang in the link below that will take you to World War II slang. It's kind of interesting.